You'd think a hungry predator staring down easy, slow-moving prey would eat almost anything within reach. Here's the uncomfortable part. Predators regularly walk straight past poisonous animals that would be effortless to catch, even when they're genuinely starving. And the reason isn't caution or intelligence or restraint, it's something far more specific and far older. So let's actually ask the question properly. Why would a predator whose entire survival depends on successfully catching and eating food deliberately ignore prey that's slow, defenseless, and sitting right in front of it? Because the honest answer isn't that predators are being careful in any conscious sense. It's that evolution has built layered, largely automatic recognition and avoidance systems into predator behavior over millions of years. Systems shaped by an enormous, brutal data set of trial and error, stretching back long before any individual predator alive today was ever born. Let's start with the most direct mechanism, aposematism, a term researchers studying predator-prey dynamics use to describe warning coloration. Bright, high-contrast colors and patterns that many toxic animals display specifically to advertise their danger rather than hide it. Poison dart frogs, certain caterpillars, coral snakes, and numerous other toxic species share a genuinely consistent visual pattern across completely unrelated evolutionary lineages. Vivid reds, yellows, oranges, and blacks, often in bold, high-contrast combinations that stand out dramatically against natural backgrounds rather than blending into them. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't camouflage failing. It's the exact opposite strategy. A toxic animal that successfully signals its danger clearly enough gets attacked far less often than one that tries to hide. Because a predator that never has to risk a genuinely painful or fatal encounter to learn the lesson is a predator that survives to hunt safer prey another day. This connects directly to something researchers studying animal cognition have documented extensively: one trial learning, or in some cases, inherited avoidance that requires no individual learning at all. Many predator species that encounter a toxic, brightly colored animal for the first time and survive the experience form an extremely strong, long-lasting negative association almost immediately, frequently after just a single encounter. A young predator that gets a mouthful of foul-tasting or genuinely harmful toxin from a brightly patterned insect or amphibian will typically avoid anything resembling that same color pattern for the rest of its life, sometimes generalizing that avoidance to other, unrelated species that happen to share similar warning coloration. This single exposure learning represents a genuinely efficient survival strategy, since a predator that needed repeated exposures to learn this lesson would face considerably higher cumulative risk of a fatal encounter along the way. There's a deeper, genuinely fascinating layer beneath this individual learning process worth examining directly, because in numerous documented cases, predator avoidance of specific toxic prey appears to be at least partially innate, rather than purely learned through individual experience. Researchers studying naive predators, animals raised in captivity with zero prior exposure to specific toxic species, have found that many show measurable, statistically significant avoidance or heightened caution toward warning coloration on their very first encounter, before any individual learning could possibly account for the behavior. This suggests that natural selection, operating across an almost unimaginable number of predator generations, has directly encoded a baseline caution towards specific colors and patterns into predator instinct itself. Essentially, a genetically inherited warning system built from the accumulated, brutal statistical experience of countless ancestral predators who didn't survive their own encounters with toxic prey. It's worth exploring the chemistry side of this equation directly, because understanding what these toxins actually do helps explain why the evolutionary pressure toward avoidance became so strong in the first place. Toxins found across the animal kingdom's most dangerous prey species operate through a genuinely diverse range of mechanisms. Some disrupt nerve signal transmission, some interfere directly with heart function, some cause severe, immediate gastrointestinal distress specifically designed to be memorable and unpleasant without necessarily being lethal in smaller doses. Poison dart frogs, among the most extensively studied toxic prey species, produce Batrachotoxin, a compound potent enough that certain species carry sufficient toxin to be genuinely lethal to multiple full-grown predators from a single individual frog. Researchers studying these toxins have found they work specifically by disrupting sodium channels in nerve and muscle cells, causing paralysis and cardiac arrest in sufficient doses, a mechanism so consistently dangerous across such a wide range of predator species that avoidance became an overwhelmingly stronger evolutionary strategy than any form of tolerance or resistance ever could. This raises a genuinely interesting comparative question worth addressing directly, because avoidance isn't actually the only evolutionary strategy that emerged in response to toxic prey, and examining the exceptions helps clarify why avoidance became the dominant approach for most predator species specifically. A small number of predator species have evolved genuine, specific physiological resistance to particular toxins, allowing them to safely consume prey that would be lethal to almost any other predator. Certain snake species have evolved resistance to specific toxins found in their typical prey, and some mammalian predators show documented resistance to venoms from prey they regularly hunt. However, researchers studying the evolutionary cost of this kind of specific toxin resistance have found it typically requires highly specialized, metabolically costly physiological adaptations. Adaptations that only make evolutionary sense when a predator's survival strategy depends heavily and consistently on that specific toxic prey source being available. For the vast majority of predator species, whose diets remain considerably more generalized and flexible, developing this kind of expensive, narrow physiological specialization simply doesn't provide enough evolutionary benefit to outweigh the cost, making simple avoidance a dramatically more efficient strategy across almost the entire predator population. There's a particularly interesting related phenomenon worth examining here, Batesian mimicry, because it demonstrates just how powerful and widespread this avoidance instinct has become across entire ecosystems. Researchers studying mimicry have documented numerous cases where a completely harmless, non-toxic species evolves to closely resemble the warning coloration of an actual toxic species, essentially borrowing the protective reputation of a genuinely dangerous animal without possessing any of the actual toxicity itself. Certain harmless snake species, moths, and other creatures have evolved coloration patterns strikingly similar to genuinely venomous or toxic counterparts, and predators, operating on the same learned or inherited avoidance triggered by that specific warning coloration, frequently avoid these harmless mimics just as thoroughly as they avoid the genuinely dangerous species being imitated. This phenomenon reveals something genuinely important about how this entire system operates. Predator avoidance isn't necessarily based on individually verifying each specific animal's actual danger level. It's frequently based on pattern recognition triggered by visual signals that have proven reliable enough, on average, across an entire evolutionary history to make avoidance the statistically safer default response. It's worth being genuinely precise about the limits of this pattern too, because predator avoidance of toxic prey isn't remotely absolute across every circumstance, and examining the exceptions reinforces rather than contradicts the underlying risk calculation logic we've already established. Researchers studying predator behavior during periods of extreme food scarcity have documented increased instances of predators attempting to consume toxic prey they would normally avoid entirely. Essentially the same desperation-driven risk recalibration we've covered in earlier videos on this channel regarding predator-on-predator consumption. When the alternative to attempting a risky meal becomes genuine, immediate starvation, the calculated risk avoidance strategy that governs normal predator behavior can shift meaningfully, though researchers have also documented that predators attempting this desperate strategy frequently show specific behavioral adaptations even then, consuming only certain body parts known through inherited or learned experience to carry lower toxin concentrations, or engaging in specific preparation behaviors. Some predators have been observed rubbing or rolling toxic prey against rough surfaces before attempting consumption, appearing to specifically target and remove toxin-secreting glands beforehand. This last point deserves genuinely closer examination, because it reveals a level of behavioral sophistication worth understanding in more depth. Researchers studying specific predator species that do occasionally consume mildly toxic prey have documented remarkably specific preparation behaviors that appear directly aimed at reducing toxin exposure before consumption. Certain bird species that consume toxic caterpillars have been observed specifically wiping the caterpillar against a branch repeatedly before eating it, a behavior that researchers have connected directly to physically removing toxin-containing hairs or glands from the caterpillar's body before ingestion. This kind of specific targeted preparation behavior suggests these predators aren't just broadly avoiding or broadly consuming toxic prey. As a simple binary choice, in some documented cases they're engaging in genuinely sophisticated risk mitigation behavior that allows them to access an otherwise off-limits food source specifically by neutralizing the exact mechanism that makes it dangerous in the first place. There's a genuinely important comparative angle worth exploring here too, because juvenile predators specifically represent one of the most consistently vulnerable populations when it comes to toxic prey encounters, predators, and researchers studying this vulnerability have found it reveals something important about how the learning and inheritance systems we've discussed actually interact in practice. Young predators without prior experience or fully developed innate avoidance responses account for a disproportionate share of documented predator deaths and serious injuries from toxic prey encounters, precisely the population you'd expect to be most vulnerable if avoidance genuinely does require some combination of individual learning and only partially complete innate caution. This pattern provides genuinely strong supporting evidence for the broader picture we've built throughout this video, that predator avoidance of toxic prey isn't a simple, complete, universally hardwired instinct present from birth, but rather a layered system combining partial innate caution with critical, often costly individual learning that becomes considerably more refined and reliable as a predator matures and survives its own early encounters. So the picture that emerges here isn't really about predators being cautious, restrained, or somehow morally hesitant about which prey they choose to pursue. It's about an extraordinarily specific, layered evolutionary system, warning coloration that reliably signals genuine danger, rapid and sometimes single exposure learning that locks in avoidance after survivable encounters, partially innate caution inherited from countless generations of ancestral predators who didn't survive their own encounters, and in rare specialized cases, genuine physiological resistance, or targeted risk mitigation behavior that allows specific predators to safely access an otherwise dangerous food source. All of it combines into a remarkably consistent pattern across an enormous range of unrelated predator species, one shaped not by conscious calculation in the moment, but by an almost unimaginably long accumulated history of trial, error, and consequence. So the next time you see a brightly colored frog, insect, or snake sitting completely exposed in the open, seemingly unbothered by the predators around it, it's worth remembering that its safety isn't luck, and it isn't because predators have decided to leave it alone out of some sense of caution or restraint in the moment. It's the visible result of an ancient, remarkably effective communication system, one where a toxic animal's bright colors are quite literally speaking a language that predators, across countless generations of accumulated evolutionary experience, have learned, inherited, or simply been forced to understand the hard way.